Thanks, Jen, and thanks everybody for joining us for our webinar today, Questions to Start Gift Planning Conversations. I'm Nathan Stelter, Vice President of Business Development and Marketing here at the Stelter Company. And as an industry leader in plan giving marketing, we're committed to providing innovative solutions and education for all your marketing needs. We're happy to provide this complimentary webinar today presented by Greg Sharkey, Senior Philanthropy Advisor for the Nature Conservancy. And Greg and I have been in conversations for about the last 12 to 18 months to make sure we were able to share this topic, as he's shared this quite a bit around the country, and we're looking forward to quite a bit of folks joining us today. Before I pass it off to Greg, I want to say just a couple webinar series. Many of you are familiar with this, but today is actually our last webinar for the 2017 series. We're not going to try to sneak one in the next couple weeks, but this year and last and past couple of years, we posted a variety of webinars on a variety of topics with some amazing speakers, and Greg joins the groups of Christopher Hoyt, Ann Melvin from Harvard, Russell James, Jeff Comfort, Scott Lumpkin, and others. If you've missed some of those or need a refresher, our webinars are always available, as this one will be as well, to access for free at stelter.com/webinars. And feel free to check that out. If we, for 2018, we are in the planning stages for most of the year, but actually hot off the press as of this morning, our first one is going to be the end of January, January 24th, around the Tax Reform Act, what may or may not be coming out of that in the coming days and weeks. Our own Lynn Gomer, Senior Technical Advisor, will be leading that along with a longtime friend and partner, Larry Katzenstein, Harvard Law grad and partner at Thompson Cobert in St. Louis. So that will be the first one of our 2018 series, followed by, in February, we hope to bring a social media case study to you that got rave reviews at the national conference this year. If you have any suggestions, as always, for any topics, you'll be allotted an opportunity post-webinar with a survey, so do feel free to share those thoughts. Back to today's presentation. Our presenter today, as I mentioned, Greg Sharkey, serves as Senior Philanthropic Advisor for the Nature Conservancy. He assists donors in considering various gift plans to accomplish their philanthropic and financial goals, helping them to achieve their philanthropic, financial, and estate planning goals through charitable giving. He works with state-based fundraising teams across the country with strategies for their donors. Greg also counsels donors on the features, benefits, and limitations of charitable giving platforms like donor-advised funds and private foundations. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy in January 2008, he served as Director of Plan Giving and Senior Development Officer at his alma mater, Denison University. Greg directed all aspects of Denison's plan giving program and managed a traditional portfolio of major gift prospects as well. He's a trial lawyer and partner in the Philadelphia law firm of Sweeney, Sheehan, and Spencer. Prior to his career in philanthropy, he's a graduate of Denison University and Villanova University School of Law. Greg was the board chair of our own National Association of Charitable Gift Planners as recently as 2015. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Greg. Greg, I believe your phone might be muted. Apologize here. He was on the phone prior to the call.
Yeah, hi Greg, this is Jen, and I can just see from our GoToMeeting software, it says that you're self-muted on your telephone. So I don't know if you can assign to that mute button, and so that we can hear you. And if not, we'll go ahead and pause the presentation and get back with everyone that's joined us in just a minute while we figure out how to get Greg on the line.
For those of you who just joined the call, we're just having a couple audio difficulties connecting Greg. Please give us just a couple seconds here.
Greg, it does look like you unmuted yourself, so that's step one. It might work best if you go ahead and disconnect your audio and call back in on the phone number that you were sent. And again, to everyone listening in, we apologize. This happens just once in a while. I think the first time in 2017, so that's pretty good at the end of the year. So I'm going to go ahead and pause real quick, and we'll see if we can get Greg back on.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got you, Greg.
Okay, Nathan, do you have me now?
We do. Good to hear.
Sorry,
good to hear your voice.
The phone, for whatever reason, just muted itself, but who knows what's going on. Hopefully that will not happen again. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to put the phone down. And do you still have me?
We can hear you now.
All right, great. All right, take two. So thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking about my favorite topic, and start and continue gift planning conversations. You know, it's so important, in my view, to be asking good, thoughtful questions. Among other things, it really allows us to build rapport, to learn about what they really value, what's most important to them, and it ultimately puts us in the best position to help them as partners to achieve their philanthropic goals. So while we have some slides today on the screen, again, as Jen mentioned, I'd like to encourage everyone to kind of reference the 5-page handout that she told you about throughout the call, because what I'm going to do is we've highlighted some questions on the slide, but I'm going to be working my way through that handout. And what I'll do is I'm going to do a couple of sections at a time, and I'll some of the questions, not going to go through all the questions, and I'm going to tell some short stories about how those questions led to a charitable gift. And then I'm going to pause and ask you all if you have any questions or comments after I do 2 or 3 of those sections. So as Jen mentioned, please feel free to chat your questions to her. She'll be kind of screening them, and she'll be asking me some or all of those questions throughout our time today. So thanks for your help on that, Jen. And let's dive right into the questions. And this whole first section, you see life transitions on the slide. And this is really all about talking about the future with our donors. And my experience has been that when donors are in any kind of transition, and you see the one on the screen is retirement because that's the one we'll talk about first, they are often in planning mode. And when donors are in planning mode, there is often an opportunity to do some very significant charitable giving. So very important that we be talking to donors about retirement, about, you know, whether they're thinking about that in some form, and what does that look like? Because retirement, in my experience, looks a lot different these days than 20 years ago for a lot of folks. They're not looking to just totally kick back. They're actually looking for more meaning in retirement. And talk about that, and, you know, how their retirement might affect their philanthropy. Where do they want to live? How do they want to spend their time and energy? These are all questions we can ask donors. And I have just a brief story showing how one of these conversations led to a gift. I was in conversation a couple of years ago with a gentleman who was approaching retirement age. And I didn't want to, you know, of course we have to be careful here because you don't want to presume someone feel maybe older than they are. But we had talked throughout the first 20 minutes, and I got a feeling that he was maybe low. He said, you know, what does retirement look like for you? On that, he said, you know, our kids have all moved down south, and so we're thinking we might actually move down to be closer to them and our grandkids. And, our original plan was to build a vacation home up here in Ohio, but those plans have kind of changed now. And he told me a little bit about the property he was going to build the home on, and it turns out it was very valuable lakefront property. And I said to him, so what are you going to do with the property? Well, Greg, I don't know what I'm going to do with the property. And I say, are you counting on the proceeds from if you sell it to, fund your lifestyle and retirement? And the donor said, no, I've got that all covered. I'm not counting on the proceeds from that property. And so we started to talk about, I said, you might think about making some form of charitable gift with that property. And we talked about lots of different options, life income gift, an outright gift. He ultimately decided to give us this very valuable lot outright, and it took us all of about 2 weeks to sell it. And with the proceeds, we used those to support some very important conservation work that this donor cared deeply about. And so that's just an example of how, there's a lot of transition planning going on around retirement, and by engaging in the conversation with the donor, that actually led to, discovering that he had this piece of real estate that he really no longer needed. And so that's retirement. The next transition I want to speak to briefly before I pause and ask for some questions and comments is the sale of a business. I have the good fortune, and I'm sure many of my colleagues out there on the line today do as well, of dealing with a lot of very successful business owners who founded businesses, privately held businesses, and have really built them into very successful enterprises. And I love talking with donors about their businesses because in many cases, it's their baby. It's a big, big part of their life. And so there are a lot of times I think we know what the business does, but the question I like to ask is, Joe, tell me the story of your business, because then it's going to be broader than just what they make. And the answer is actually oftentimes a lot more revealing than just, what the business is, what they make. What's the story of your business? That's a good open-ended question. And I think open-ended questions are really the key to get donors talking. That's great. What are you proudest of in terms of what you've created in the business? What's your biggest challenge been? How did you overcome that? And then there comes a point in time, it's very natural as part of this broader conversation about the business, what are your future plans for the business? And oftentimes, I was recently in Oregon, oftentimes the donors will say, actually, we've decided to sell the business next year. And that's what this donor told me in Portland about 3 weeks ago. So we had a big discussion about what would be involved and whether they might consider using some of those privately held business interests. And here, basically, they're formed as an LLC. So maybe some of those LLC units to make a charitable gift. I had the good fortune, quick story on the sale of the business. I had the good fortune of working with the donor a few years ago who built a very highly successful business out west. And we got into the same type of conversation. And his business was a privately held C Corp. And I asked, what are the future plans for your business? He said, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm thinking about selling the business. I've had some offers. And, I said, boy, how do you feel about that? Because, when someone is looking to sell a business they founded, it's not only an economic decision, it's an emotional decision as well. He was torn. He loves his employees. He wanted to make sure that they were going to be really well taken care of. But ultimately, what this gentleman did, because we were in there having the conversation with him, is he took a significant block of his C Corp stock before he sold the business. And he gave that very valuable block of stock to the Nature Conservancy. And we took the stock, and after the sale was complete, the acquiring company came knocking, love to buy that. He would stock, right? Because it's a profit for, we're going to sell it. Have a, but we sold it back to the donor had made a gift, and we were the charitable, but that was, and it was plan, make some charitable plans through that transition. So not only is the family taken care of because they didn't, but they were able to do something really, really significant from a charitable standpoint using that closely held business, that C Corp stock. So bottom line is here that we need to be talking with donors about their businesses. And you know, one final point, I have been with some donors who have said, oh, Greg, they're going to carry me out of here. I'm never going to sell the business. 6 months later, I've been in there and they've basically told me, yeah, I've changed my mind on the business. And the point there is that not a one-time conversation. We need to be constantly talking with donors about their businesses. There are amazing amounts of assets in these businesses. They're very valuable, and they, in many cases, are great assets to make large charitable gifts with. So I want to pause there. We've done our first 2 life transitions, and ask Jen if there are any questions or comments in the queue at this point that you might like to share with me.
Sure, Greg. We just have one that came in, and I feel like you're going to probably be covering this throughout the rest of the presentation, so you can decide if you want to address it. But Karen was just asking, you had talked about retirement on your first slide here, and she was asking what type of conversations could you start if the donor has already retired?
Sure. So if the donor is already retired, one of the questions I love to ask is, so Jim, you retired last year. Tell me, how is life? How are you finding retirement? You know, how are you, what does your day look like? You know, are you glad you retired when you did? So you can open up a conversation again with open-ended questions that gets them talking about retirement and what they're doing in retirement. And one of those, you know, I remember working with one donor in particular, and they don't all lead to, you know, charitable gifts, but this one donor in particular, we started talking about his retirement, and then we got on to he was spending more and more of his time managing his investments in retirement. And that led to a discussion about his investment philosophy, which we'll be getting to a little bit later. And he basically had come to the point in his life where he was done accumulating, and he had decided to start making large gifts with some of those investments. So still very much opportunity to talk with donors even after they've retired. And sometimes those discussions lead to various types of charitable gifts. So thanks very much for the question. And is that what we had on those transitions, Jen? Should I move forward?
We have one more question.
Okay.
We have Heather asking, were there tax advantages for the donor who donated the real estate versus selling it and donating the proceeds?
Yes, there were huge tax advantages, and the biggest difference was this real estate was highly, highly appreciated. The donor had purchased it about 30 years earlier, and the real estate was close to worth to nothing. I mean, their cost basis, what they paid for it, was very low. Fast forward 30 years, this lot now was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so the donor had a lot of capital gain in that real estate. And the donor was able to not only get a charitable income tax deduction for the full fair market appraised value of the real estate when he gave it to us, but he avoided all of the very significant capital gain that he had in that piece of real estate. So the donor got what we call the double tax benefit of both big income tax deduction and avoided all the capital gain that had built up. So thank you for the question. Yes, very compelling benefits, and the same double tax benefit applied in the case of the donor who gave the closely held stock. He got that same kind of double tax benefit, and that's why in general are such a compelling and smart asset to charity. Let's
Okay,
go
thanks,
ahead.
Greg.
Yeah.
I was just going to say we had a couple more that were pretty specific, and we will save those, and maybe that's something you can address with the individual personally. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, you can go ahead and move on.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
if we don't get to all of your questions today, guys, I promise I'll give you a call, or can kind of continue the discussion. So the next transitions that we wanted to talk about, it's actually 3 transitions: loss of a family member or personal illness. And I want to preface, we all, as professionals, we all have to use our judgment as to when these conversations might be appropriate. Unfortunately, I have dealt with many donors throughout the course of my career who, unexpectedly lost a family member or had a very dire diagnosis themselves in terms of their health. And this was causing them to think a little bit differently about their philanthropy. And in the case of a family member, I want to say too that, when someone loses, say, a spouse, we're in relationships with our donors and we care about them and we want to show that care. And so I think it's really important that we not only be with them when everything's going great in their lives and the good times, that we also be there for them in the bad times. And so I think at times we're overly sensitive and we feel, oh, well, Joe lost Mary and we have to just stay away from that for a while. I think that's a mistake. I think that we should, show that genuine caring concern, beyond sending a note of condolence, to check in at what you feel is the appropriate point. It might be a month later, it might be 2 months later, but let the donor tell us when they're ready to re-engage with us. Just don't assume like, okay, well, I can't call her for another year because she lost her husband. To not be too deferential. My experience is some donors are ready to kind of re-engage with a charity they care about, 2 months after they've lost someone. Other donors, it's 6 months. Other donors, it's a year. It varies, but the key, I think, is to ask the donor and to engage them in a conversation if they're willing about a spouse. And I've had many of these conversations, what was important to him and how would he want to be remembered? And there are some cases too that, this is not every case, but there are some cases where actually the donor ends up making a large memorial gift, for lack of a better term, in honor of their spouse. And so let's kind of continue to lean in, use our judgment, but not totally back away when the donor has a difficult, personal situation. Same thing with a personal illness. I've worked with, unfortunately, more than a few donors who have gotten a very dire diagnosis, many who got it, much earlier in life, in their 60s or 50s, and it did. They wanted to talk about, how they were thinking about their philanthropy, and in some cases, they accelerated estate gifts because they wanted to see the results of their philanthropy now as opposed to later. And, making gifts making charitable gifts when you're very ill can actually be, very uplifting and life affirming. And I've had several donors tell me that personally. So again, let's not just totally back away when something bad happens. And the final transition that I'm going to talk about today is inheritance, which can be a real game changer for some donors. And the way I usually get into this area is, I'm genuinely interested in knowing not only about our donors, but also tell me about your parents. What were they all about? What were their values? What did they do? How did they shape you? And and inevitably what sometimes comes out of these conversations is we have and I'm thinking of donors I was with last fall who said, Greg, we only have one of our parents left, and we're actually going to be coming into some significant money. It's not going to be $100 million, but it's probably going to be $10 million. And what we're thinking of is we might take half of it and renovate our vacation home, and the other half, we'd like some ideas of what we would do to support the Nature Conservancy and some of our conservation priorities. And so we had a conversation about that. And not to be morbid, but they wanted to get out ahead because the parent who was still alive was 95, and she was in good health, but she was 95, and so they wanted to talk about that. So let's go to, let me pause here and ask if there are any questions or comments before we go on to the next section on values and motivation. Jen, are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, we certainly have a couple. Scott is asking, he works for an animal welfare agency, and many donors lose their pets, and he's wondering if you have any thoughts on how that kind of a loss could possibly lead to a plan giving discussion.
Yeah, so he works for an animal shelter?
Yes, an animal welfare agency, and talking about donors that lose their pets, and any thoughts around conversations that might spark a conversation about their loss of their pet that would work itself into a plan giving discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we had the privilege of caring for your pet all those years, and, we know how much you loved your pet. Tell me how you're doing, and tell me what did your pet mean to you, and get them talking about that. And you might as part of that discussion, if it's appropriate, if you feel it's appropriate as part of that same discussion, you might say, we have some opportunities, knowing how much you cared for your pet, we have some opportunities if you'd like to, consider making a gift in their honor to our facility to help. We helped your pet, we help lots of other pets. If you'd like kind of your legacy and your pet's legacy to be, one that is about helping others, you might consider a gift in some to our facility. So it's I think donors, know when you're coming from a perspective of real concern and care for them versus, just trying to, maybe use that as an opportunity to get a gift. And some might be uncomfortable having that conversation, but I think if you really, in your heart, you're coming at it from from the vantage of being concerned and of caring, that it really in a genuine way to suggest, perhaps consider, honoring your pet and making that part of your legacy, with something that just like we helped your pet, we're going to be able to help lots of other pets, and maybe maybe one of your pets in the future if you get a new pet. So, that's how I would come at it.
Yeah, this is Nathan, Greg. That's a great point, and actually just wanted to reiterate that is exactly what a couple different research projects have been showing, is the idea of honor and tribute, and especially as an extended part of your family, as many pets are. Both Dr. James' research as well as some of the stuff that we've commissioned, we've seen that has always been the number one thing that drives some of the interest in making these types of gifts. So I would wholeheartedly agree. I think Jen has maybe one or two more questions that have popped up here.
Sure.
Yeah, Megan is wondering, Greg, talking about life transitions, how do you feel about divorce? Is it a mistake or a prospect tells you that they're getting a divorce or in the midst of a divorce?
No, that's a great question, and I do think that falls into the same category, that we tread carefully, but we care about this person, and maybe they don't have too many other people, and I'm not saying they're not well liked, but maybe they don't have too many other people that they can talk to about this. So I think divorce is something, again, we use our judgment, but we say, hey, how are you doing? How has this changed your life? Has it changed, later in the conversation, has it changed how you think about your philanthropy? How so? So I would also, you pick your spot carefully, but I would also lean into that discussion about divorce. And I thank you very much for raising that, because that is a very, very important transition, and one that, again, I think we have to, lean in where appropriate, as opposed to, running in the other direction.
Okay, Greg, we've got a couple more, but I think we'll move on and we'll cull through them for your next
Okay.
stop.
Great. Yeah, and again, I'll be in touch with you guys via phone or email. So let's go to the values, motivations, and family. And I'm going to focus here, talk about motivation. And you see a slide on the screen, and there's a question on the handout that is basically, Mary, would you share the story of one of your charitable gifts? You've been so generous over the years. Share the story of one gift that was particularly meaningful to you and why. And by the way, and when I say, and by the way, it does to the Nature Conservancy. So I think it's helpful to add that it doesn't have to be a gift to my charity. Just share the story of one gift. This is a question that was shared with me by my good friend Jay Steenheisen, who many on the call probably know. And I love this question. I ask it a lot. And the reason I ask it is it really gets at, you hear some great stories, and it's very revealing, because a lot of times the donors will give you a real insight into what motivates their charitable giving, not what they're interested in. I think a lot of times we as development professionals are all focused on, what are they interested? Are they interested, or in the case of conservation, are they interested in this particular conservation project? That's all well and good, but I would argue that knowing a donor's motivation is every bit as important, if not more important, than knowing what they're interested in. And so I sometimes ask this question as tell me just generally, what motivates you to be so generous, Joe? And hear them talk on it. So you can ask this question in a number of different ways, but I want to tell a quick story to illustrate the beauty of this question. I was with a gentleman in my hometown of Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and he runs a very successful business up in North Jersey. He was down in Philly on some business, And we met and we talked a lot about his business, but we got to a point in the conversation. I said, John, tell me, I asked him this question, share the story of one charitable gift that was particularly meaningful to you and why. And he thought, now, I just shut up. It's like after you make a big ask. I just had to keep quiet, let him think, because chances are if we ask this question, they've never been asked this question before in their life. So they might have to think for a little while. So I gave him about 10 seconds, and then I saw like the light bulb went off. He snapped his fingers. He said, oh, I know the gift. And he told me the story of a gift that he had made to build a school in northern Jersey. And it was a long story, but basically I said, so why was that gift so meaningful to you, John? And he said, Greg, I knew they had been trying to build that school for years with no success. And they couldn't find anyone to come up with the money. I knew that if not for me, that school was never going to get built. If not for me, that school was never going to get built. That is what motivated him to make, up to that point in time, his largest charitable gift. Well, that kind of information is gold to us as development professionals. And I thank John for sharing that. And my colleagues in New Jersey, the Jersey chapter of the Nature Conservancy, went back and they, about 6 months later, put together a proposal that spoke to that motivation. It was a particular project it wasn't real sexy, it wasn't going to get funded, and it was kind of in John's backyard. And he went from being a $10,000 giver to the Nature Conservancy. He was a very generous guy, but he was fairly new to us. He made a $500,000 gift commitment because, again, we play, and we told him, we said, you told Sharkey, we played to that motivation. And so I think asking this type of question is just a great way to get to know your donor in a whole different way and on a much deeper level. So let's go, because we're a little limited on time, let's skip over to charitable giving platforms. There are over $85 billion in assets in donor-advised funds in this country right now. And of course, there are, $750 billion in private foundations, but donor-advised funds in particular are growing at just an exponential rate. And there is so much money in both of these platforms. And let's think about that. These are charitable dollars that have already been set aside for the express purpose of doing charitable giving with. And so we need to be in conversation with donors about these entities. And one of the questions do you use charitable giving platforms like private foundations or donor-advised funds? What inspired you to create it? What are your goals? How do you like to use it? Would you consider a special gift from your new donor-advised fund to the Conservancy? So I find that many donors have donor-advised funds that my organization does not yet know about when I ask this question. And I was with a donor last year who I asked this question. She said, oh, yeah, I have a new donor-advised fund with Schwab. Great. And what inspired you to create it? Well, I had like a bunch of old Pfizer stock. It was like over $1 million, and I decided to, put it into this donor-advised fund so I could kind of fund my giving for a few years. Well, we knew none of that prior to asking the question. So it's really important to get into these conversations. One of the other major trends we see, and I know all the big donor-advised fund hosts see this as well, is we have many donors who are they're terminating their private foundations, and they are establishing donor-advised funds with those assets. And so it's really important to ask donors, hey, how is your private foundation working for you? Because in my experience, there are many donors who are not having a good experience with their private foundation for a variety of reasons, costs, or it's just they feel it's too much of a hassle and it's not as easy as they'd like it to be. And what they do is they end up establishing donor advised funds. When I ask that question, how is your private foundation working for you? There are times about 20 minutes later I get to ask my next question because they're so upset with how their private foundation is going. Now, this is not a knock on private foundations, but it's clear to me as a planner that there were many that were set up years ago and there wasn't enough thought into what the donors were trying to accomplish with the private foundation. So really important to ask. And the last thing I'll say here is that many high net worth donors use both private foundations and donor advised funds. And they'll have a private foundation and maybe they want to make an anonymous gift. So they'll send a gift to the donor advised fund. They can make an anonymous gift through their donor advised fund. They can't do that through the private foundation because we all know as fundraisers, we can look up on their 990 PF and see exactly what they're doing with their private foundation. So really important to engage donors in conversations about private foundations and donor advised funds. Let's move to the next slide, and then I'll pause for some comments and questions. And this is having the estate planning conversation. And I want to say up front that this is not just the job of the plan giving department at charities. Major gift officers, annual funds, everyone should be having these conversations with donors on a regular basis. And the way I get into the conversation is, Mary, tell me, why have you been so generous to us through the years? And they answer, and oftentimes it's a lengthy answer, and you hear how much they love the organization, how much they care for the organization. And after they've answered that, it's then very natural, and it's a very soft ask. It's very natural to say, given how strongly you feel about our organization and conservation, I wanted to ask if you might be willing to consider placing the Nature Conservancy, insert charity, in your estate plans. Want to ask if you might consider. It's a very soft ask. And it's important that all of us, regardless of our title, be having these discussions with donors, because these are the funds that ensure the future of the charities and the causes we love. And we see it firsthand at the Nature Conservancy. We've had a culture of having these conversations for many, many years with donors. And every year, year in, year out, we're over $100 million in realized estate gifts. That's just realized. That doesn't count all the new ones coming in. And my point is that if you build a culture, you can really grow the program in a big way. And so let's have these conversations, regardless of title. Let's have these conversations with our donors. I'm going to pause there. And Jen, do we have any questions or comments, or should I just keep going given the time limitation?
We have a couple about the donor advised funds. Maybe you can answer quickly. Just two people are wondering how you go about gaining the information that the donor has the fund. Are you quite direct about that?
Yes, I say, do you use donor advised funds? And so to make it more conversational, the way I do it is, boy, Joe, I am reading so much about donor advised funds these days and how they're growing. And you might add, and a lot of the donors I work with are establishing donor advised funds. You don't need both of those elements, but either of those elements. Is that something you use to help you with your charitable giving? And it's really that simple. So you make it conversational. And, you know, because as we know, those of us who read the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and there isn't a week that goes by that there isn't a story on donor advised funds, someone who's made a big DAF gift, or the growth of donor advised funds. National Philanthropic Trust publishes a report every year in November that's available to all of us. If you just Google National Philanthropic Trust, that tells you of the 1,000 donor advised fund sponsors in the country, tells you everything you want to know about in the aggregate about what's happening with donor advised funds. So yes, I just asked very directly and in a conversational way, because they are becoming really well known. And when I ask that question, most of the time the donor will say something like, yeah, you know, I think I have read or heard about them. Tell me what that's about. And then that's an opportunity to just, you know, help educate them on what DAFs are.
Sure. Along that same line, Scott's asking, talking about private foundations and donor advised funds, is one giving vehicle more advantageous to nonprofits?
I think they're both advantageous to nonprofits. I really do. Those are dollars that if we do our jobs and engage the donors who are involved in those entities, we're going to see some of those dollars flow and some of those gifts flow to our charity. So, you know, I think there are some in the nonprofit world, when they hear a donor is creating a private foundation or a donor advised fund, they think, oh gosh, you know, that stinks. Why don't they give that money directly to us? Well, you know, from the donor's perspective, there are often very good reasons to establish one of the or both of these entities, and it all has to do with the word control. It gives the donor more control. They don't have to make all their giving decisions right then and there. For someone who sells their business and, you know, is totally wrapped up in the sale and is trying to establish a $10 million donor advised fund or private foundation that same year, they don't make decisions. Their life is wrapped up in the sale. They have a million other things to do. And so it makes a them to put those assets in a vehicle where they can take a little time. They get the immediate tax deduction up front, but they get the gift of time to do thoughtful philanthropy over, you know, not just all in the year they sold their business. So I think they're both advantageous to charity, and it's our job to be in there and talking with donors about their private foundations and donor advised funds so that we can help them achieve their charitable goals with many of those funds in those vehicles.
Okay, Greg, I don't know how you feel. You do have a couple more slides, so do you want to try to get through them, or we do have a lot of questions? We could just end with the questions.
Let's go quickly, because I just want to make a couple of quick points on talking about, you know, most of our donors hold the vast bulk of their wealth in non-cash assets. And so if all we're talking to them about is cash, and we're not learning about the other assets they have to be with, there's a lot of philanthropic potential being left on the table. And so one of the questions that I like to ask is, instead of, you know, Mark, tell me about your investment portfolio, that question's probably going to go nowhere. But if you phrase it somewhat differently, if you say, what's your investment philosophy? My experience is donors will talk on that question all day long, and they'll tell you about some of their high-performing stocks. And I was just on a trip to Portland, Oregon recently, got into this conversation from that question, was also asking, how are you feeling about the stock market? The donor told me about this particular stock that was super highly appreciated. He had some fears that there's going to be a coming correction in the stock market. And the following week, he made a $650,000 gift with this really highly performing stock because he wanted to lock in those gains. He's concerned that there's a correction coming. And so he thought, hey, now is the time to use this stock. But really important to talk with donors about their investment philosophy. The other important point I'd like to point out here is that let's not assume that donors know about the double tax benefit of giving appreciated assets, whether it's real estate or stock, because it never ceases to amaze me in my travels how many donors, savvy donors who are really smart, do not realize what a great deal it is for them to give appreciated stock. And I was in New Jersey last year, met with a donor, always made cash gifts, very generous guy. And we said, have you ever considered giving appreciated assets? Why? He knew nothing about it. Again, we explained the double tax benefit, and he was just getting started on a campaign gift. The very next week, he made a gift that was a lot larger than he had ever made with some mutual fund shares. So let's not assume it's a service. If you see a donor who's giving cash all the time, hey, cash is great, we love cash, but in terms of their well-being, it's often much better for them to be giving appreciated assets. So a question like, are you aware, or a lot of donors who are giving generously at your level use appreciated assets, are you aware of the benefits of giving those? Because a lot of donors do not, or they either have never been told, or they were told years ago and they forgot. And it's a real service for us to talk with donors about that. The one other area I want to point out real quickly is real estate. And that is, there is so much wealth held in real estate in this country. And we miss an opportunity if we don't talk about this with our donors. And a question like, where do you vacation? Now, you would think, well, how's that going to lead to a gift? That has been the question that's led to several gifts over the course of my career. Where do you vacation? And I was working with donors here in the Midwest. Oh, we have a vacation home out in Tucson, Arizona. Do you get out there? No, we're getting older. I find a lot of donors are looking to simplify as they get older, and they might own 3 or 4 homes, and it makes good sense for them, and they're not counting on the proceeds of the real estate to fund their lifestyle. It makes good sense for them to consider using that asset to make a charitable gift. And that's exactly what this couple did with the vacation home in Tucson. We got involved in a conversation, many of these questions in the real estate section, and they ended up making an outright gift of this really valuable vacation home in Tucson that we then turned around and sold and used the proceeds to support work they really cared about. The one other question in real estate, do you invest in real estate? How did you get into that? I just, again, donors I met with earlier this fall told me the story of how they built this kind of mini empire of apartment houses. And they've ended up giving one, or actually giving 2, to the Nature Conservancy. So let's talk about real estate with donors, because there is so much wealth held in that area. And with that, Jen, I'll go over to you, ask if we have any final questions you'd like me to address, as I see we're short on time. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, actually, we have a lot of questions. We're not going to get through them. We just have a couple minutes left. So I'm just going to pick a couple out. One that just came in, Gail is asking, when you're having these conversations, do you take notes? And if you do donors comment on you taking notes?
I take notes. It's a really interesting question. I take notes in some of the conversations. Some of the conversations, I don't take notes. I don't have kind of like a rule of thumb. It's just, I always take I have the option to write. And if before I do write on those visits where I do want to jot some things down, particularly if we're talking about like on a topic or, their investment portfolio or something that would be easy for me to lose in the, hour before I go do my contact report, I always ask them, hey, Christina, would it be okay if I took a few notes? I always ask permission. I've never had anyone say, no, please don't take notes. If I'm having a conversation in my job, my role, I offer certain things confidential, and so I'm not going to take notes on that kind of thing. But it really, I find donors have no problem with me taking notes, and in fact, I think that many really enjoy it because it shows that you're really listening. There's one other nuance, though, and that is you have to be able to take notes and really continue listening at the same time and really be present and engaged in the conversation. And if you can do that, by all means, take notes. But if you're one of these folks who takes notes and gets lost in, oh, what did they say, 30 seconds ago? Don't take notes. Just focus on listening to the person, and then have the discipline to, as soon as you leave that meeting, even if you've got another meeting to run to, as soon as you leave that meeting, jot some notes down. Like, pick the 4 or 5 most important things and jot those notes down. But long-winded way of saying I think it's fine to take notes, but ask the donor and do it only and really be listening while you're taking the notes and having, another intelligent question for them.
Right, and we have had a couple of people write in that say that, sometimes they take notes, but only if they can focus on the donor and maybe jot down notes after. So, right, yeah. I think it's a good point. If you can't pay attention, then obviously that's not going to be a good conversation. So with that, we are 1 minute over, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. And first of all, thank you, Greg, so much for spending the last hour with us. We had over 500 people logged in today for our webinar, so that's amazing. I'm sure we all appreciated your expertise and your experiences. I did want to let everyone know that if you have additional questions we didn't get to that you would like answered, Greg has offered his email address. It's there on the screen. If you have questions about Stelter, our products or services, you can reach out to myself, Nathan, or Stella, and you can visit our website at stelter.com. And then as far as the resources that are available for this webinar, we did record it, and barring any technical difficulties, I will be posting the recording and the slides as well as the handout on our website at stelter.com/webinars. You'll get an email from me when those are available. Definitely they'll be up there by Monday, but watch your inbox. You'll get an email from me to let you know when they're there. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, spending the last hour with us late in the year. We appreciate you guys attending these webinars throughout the year. And actually, one more thing, we had a lot of questions come in about how the new tax law might affect the different conversations that Greg was talking about in the different giving vehicles. And as Nathan mentioned, Stelter is going to be hosting a webinar January 24th, I believe, with Lynn Gallmer and Larry Katzenstein to talk about the tax law and how that will affect charitable giving. So look for an invitation for that to come in the coming weeks, and you'll also be able to register on Stelter.com. So thanks so much, Greg, for being here today.
My
thank
pleasure.
you, everyone.
Take care,
and
everyone.
Have a safe and happy holidays, and we'll see you next year. Bye-bye.